Sniffing around. I had it. The wait for Edward to return was agonizing. Finally, I heard his car pull up outside and a moment later he pressed the buzzer to be let in. I had been over and over my logic in my head and was sure I was correct. I knew what Camellia was after. I knew what this was all about. Drugs. It was the only thing that made sense. Camellia and her partner, whoever that was, had planted drugs in my and Laura's backpacks. Then they took our passports, knowing this would mean we'd have to go home. Two middle-class English people, respectable looking, normal, not acting shiftily because we were oblivious to what we were carrying. The perfect drug mules. The plan must have been to intercept us once we were back in London, to retrieve the drugs before we found them. They couldn't have known that we would be thrown off the train. Or that we would leave our backpacks in a police station in Romania. I laughed when I thought about this. I would love to have seen their faces when they found this out. Then I thought about what would have happened if Laura and I hadn't left the backpacks behind, if we'd been caught at customs trying to bring illegal drugs into the country, and my laughter died. I went through it again. They had broken in, searched my flat, then come back with a dog to see if it could sniff out the drugs. I guessed they had left it here when it failed to find anything, probably in a fit of temper, wanting to punish me. Then Camellia had come back for another try, clearly believing that I must have sold the drugs. That was the illegal act she wanted me to admit to. In my moment of triumph, having figured out the mystery, I didn't stop to think about the rest of it, how this connected to all the other strange and horrible stuff that had been going on. Like, what did they hope to achieve by firebombing Edward's office? Had they killed Jake? If so, why on earth had they? Why attempt to push Laura under a tube rather than try to get information out of her? If I'd thought about it in any depth, I would have realized this violence just didn't fit. If I was a vicious drug dealer, I wouldn't pussyfoot around. I would have waited here for me, grabbed me and tortured the information out of me. But, sure, I'd solved the puzzle. I didn't wonder about that. The main question that bugged me was why they had waited so long to try to retrieve the drugs. It had been 3 months. What was the explanation for that? Edward came into the flat and before I could open my mouth to tell him about my eureka moment, he said, "You will never guess what I just saw." He ushered me into the living room, as if this was his own flat, and threw himself down on the sofa. I remained standing. "So, I went to the address you gave me, where Laura's staying. When I parked, I could see a woman standing by the gate. It was her." He pointed at the picture of Laura on the wall. Edward went on. "I was about to get out of the car, called to her, but she went into the garden. She was acting. Well, I don't know her, don't know what she's normally like, but she was acting weird. Like she was in shock or something. As if she hardly knew where she was. I went up and looked through the gate. It was odd, I could hear a woman's voice coming from somewhere in the garden, but I couldn't see anyone. I didn't want to scare her, because then I thought she'd never talk to me, but I wanted to see what she was doing. Was she talking to someone? I could hear only one voice. The voice sounded frightened, almost on the verge of hysteria. "That's what she's been like recently," I said. He nodded. Anyway, I opened the gate as quietly as I could and went into the garden. I could see Laura clearly now. She was gesticulating, miming what looked like one person striking another. And then I realized she was talking to someone else. He paused dramatically, then said, "Describe Alina to me." Alina. She was quite tall, skinny, pale skin. Black hair with red streaks in it. She wore a black leather jacket and black jeans. Quite attractive if you're into that sort of thing. Why do you want to know that now? Because I just saw Laura talking to her. What? But Daniel, unless I've developed the ability to see ghosts too, Alina is very much alive. Part 5. Romania, August-November 2013. Chapter 42. Alina stopped as she stepped between the trees and looked up at the dark canopy of the forest, black branches knitted together against the sky, the faintest watery trace of moonlight seeping through. She was a city girl. She wouldn't hesitate to walk through a dark underpass to cross one of Sibiu's roughest housing estates. Give her the darkest spaces of the city any day over this creepy, silent place. Still, she was desperate for a piss and there was no way she was going to squat in front of the English couple even if they promised to look away. She would find a spot here, close to the edge of the forest, not too far in, and then they could be on their way, so she could try to salvage this plan, make sure it worked despite what had happened. The plan had been Ion's idea. Ion. She still couldn't decide if she really liked him or not. He was good-looking, confident and capable in bed, with no hang-ups, unlike some of the more sensitive writer and artist types she'd been with. When Ion had told Daniel that he was writing a book she'd had to work hard to keep her face straight. Ion had borrowed that line straight from Alina's ex, a guy whom Ion mocked on a regular basis. All that stuff about collaborating on a graphic novel was bullshit too. Ion had no interest in her artwork, though he liked it when she drew naked women, would urge her to give them bigger breasts, curvier butts. He was an idiot really. He wasn't even that tough, even though he talked the talk. He was a schemer and a dreamer. He wasn't a violent thug. She wouldn't have been with him if he was. Anyway, once this was all over, when she had her cut of the money, she had decided she was going to leave him. She would use the money to buy herself enough time to finish her graphic novel. It was called Morella and was the story of a girl who walks the earth after she is murdered by a cabal of serial killers, seeking revenge. Morella finds everyone who is connected to her suffering and kills them in a variety of imaginative ways. Alina had already been working on it for 2 years, spending every spare minute, when she wasn't at her shitty waitressing job, immersed in this tale of blood and redemption. She didn't think Ion would care too much when she left him. He would have his money, and Alina knew he had a thing for Camelia, who had moved to London last year, dreaming of making her fortune. The last Alina heard, Camelia was working as a fucking stripper or something. It suited her. Camelia had been showing everything to the boys at school in exchange for cash since she was 14. She traded on her beauty, a slutty, obvious kind of beauty, and Alina was pretty sure the girl would either end up married to a millionaire or murdered in an alley. Her fate lay in the hands of men. Alina was different. She was going to make her own way, succeed or fail because of her own talents and luck. She accepted that sometimes, other people would get hurt along the way. She felt guilty about wrecking the English couple's holiday, for example, but not too guilty. They already had money, they were privileged without realizing it, soft and gullible. What was the worst that could happen to them? As Ion had pointed out, people like that, wholesome, middle-class English people, didn't get pulled aside at airports. With their passports stolen, their grand tour would be cut short. Oh, how her heart bled. They would go home, get married, start having babies, and they would soon forget all about their truncated trip. Best of all, they would never know what they had carried through customs. They would live on in blissful ignorance, while Ion, Alina and, unfortunately, Camelia experienced for the first time how it felt to have money. It had all started with a stroke of luck. Ion knew a guy called Chris who had ripped off a drug dealer in Sibiu and had given the cocaine to Ion for safekeeping while Chris tried to convince the drug dealer that he was innocent. Ion, who dreamed of being a gangster but was too soft to do anything about it, had gone along with it thinking it would impress his friends. With grim inevitability, the dealer and his gang had tortured and killed Chris. Ion, fearing he would be next, had suggested to Alina that they go away for a while. He sold it to her as a romantic adventure. Then came the good fortune. They got as far as Hungary when Ion heard that the dealers had been arrested and charged with Chris's murder. They would be in prison for a long time. At which point, Ion revealed to Alina that he had half a kilo of pure cocaine in his suitcase. She was furious. He had smuggled the drugs across the Hungarian border. Was he so stupid that he didn't know what happened to people caught with such a large quantity of drugs? Life in jail. For both of them. But Ion had a plan, which he laid out to her over the next hour. It involved Camellia, which immediately put Alina's back up. But Ion had already spoken to the little slut and she'd assured him that she knew someone through her pole dancing club who would be interested in buying the drugs. I can't sell them back home, he said. It's much too risky. If the gang who originally owned the drugs found out, I'd be dead. So they needed to get the coke to London. Alina stared at him. Carrying the drugs into Hungary was stupid enough, but taking it through an airport, or on a boat, into the UK. That was insane. They argued for a while about Eurostar, and how risky it actually was, when Ion let slip that he would surely get searched at customs because of his previous conviction for possession, which Alina hadn't known about. But you could do it, he said. If you love me. Single quote. Who said I love you? She asked. I'm not doing it. I'm not risking going to jail. They fought some more until, eventually, Ion said, then we'll have to find someone to take it. For us. Before that, they decided to head back into Romania, to Sibiu. They would have to cross the border again, but on the train here the guards had been half asleep. If they took the night train back, the guards would probably be comatose. They spotted the English couple at Budapest station. They didn't look like typical backpackers, they had a more well-to-do air about them, they looked cleaner, and the guy was carrying an expensive camera. Ion nudged Alina and whispered his plan to her. It was a crazy scheme. Why? Alina asked, don't we go to the airport and find an English couple there? Ion shook his head. What opportunity do you think we'll get at an airport to put the drugs into somebody's bag? This is perfect. Yet again, they argued, until Ion eventually sighed and said, okay, let's see how it plays out. She agreed, almost certain that nothing would happen. That they would end up back home with the drugs. Except, the opportunity did arise. Ion chatted them up, spinning a lie about how they were going to see her parents, who were actually both dead. Alina felt awkward and withdrawn at first, intimidated by this wealthy English couple, until she realized that she had no reason to feel like that, and she had decided to play along, to be friendly. She actually quite liked them, especially Laura, who was sweet and far less pretentious or stuck-up than Alina expected. She felt genuine sympathy for Laura when that creep stared at her. Daniel was okay too, even if he was typically eager to talk about himself. But she still didn't think they'd get the opportunity to put the cocaine into the couple's backpacks, unless one of them could lure the English couple to the buffet car, or hope they both went to the toilet at the same time, leaving their bags in their new friend's care. Then Ion spotted the empty sleeper compartment and persuaded them to go for a nap, promising to keep an eye out for guards. After they went, Ion and Alina sat in tense silence for a while, before Ion said, wait here, and carried his own bag out of their carriage. When he came back 5 minutes later he was sweating. Well, she whispered. I did it, he whispered back. They were sleeping like babies. 250 grams in each backpack. They each had a small bag of dirty laundry at the bottom of their packs. I put them in those. In dirty laundry. Yeah. Well, I figured they're not going to stop to wash their underwear on the way home. I took their passports, tickets and bank cards too. I got some keys too, in case Camellia needs them, and the girl's phone, a nice Samsung. Daniel just has a crappy, scratched-up iPhone 5 with a cracked screen, so I didn't bother. Why don't people take care of their gadgets? Single quote. Alina shook her head, wondering if she was dreaming. What are you talking about? What about the guards? When they come through to check passports, what will they do? Won't they arrest them? What for? This is why I'm a genius. They'll tell them they need to leave Romania. That as soon as we get to the end of the line they'll have to head home. I imagine they'll escort them to the airport and put them on the plane back to England. Whatever, they'll be forced to go home. A genius. She laughed and he looked hurt. Why do you have to be such a bitch? You won't be complaining when you get your hands on the money. Feeling a little contrite, she said, I'm sorry. He harumphed. Good. I'm starving. The buffet car will be open now. I'm going to get something to eat. Maybe while I'm gone you can think about why you have to be such a bitch to me. She watched him stomp off through the carriage, in the opposite direction to the sleeper carriages, contrition turning to anger. She was sick of being called a bitch. Maybe she should put him in her comic book, one of Myrla's misogynistic victims. After Ion had been gone a few minutes, the door he'd left through opened and the border guards entered. They woke the few other people in the carriage and checked their passports. They spent a while talking in low voices to one passenger who was outside of Alina's line of vision. She felt sweaty and tense. She didn't share Ion's confidence about what the guards would do when they discovered the English couple's passports were missing. What if they searched their bags? The plan would be over before it had begun, though she reminded herself there was nothing to link the drugs to her and Ion. Still, it would mean the loss of the money she was already counting on. She tried to relax, but when the guards got to her she fumbled with her own passport, dropped it on the floor, making them snap at her to hurry up. For whatever reason, they were in a bad mood and highly alert. So much for them being semi-comatose. As she retrieved her passport, someone stepped past her, heading in the direction of the sleepers. She just caught a glimpse of a man's legs. Eventually, after asking her a dozen questions that made her sweat, the guards left the carriage and headed towards the sleepers. Where was Ion? Chatting up the girl in the buffet, no doubt. She got up, went to the other end of the carriage and peered into the next one, but there was no sign of Ion. When she turned around she saw the old man whose bags she'd carried walking towards her through the carriage, presumably on his way back from the toilets, which were located just before the sleepers. She smiled at him and waited for him to take his seat, then went towards the sleepers and peered through the greasy glass. She could see the guards standing outside one of the compartments. Daniel and Laura's. Then a border guard broke away from the group and came rushing towards her, through the door, almost knocking her over, and hurried away out the door at the far end of the carriage. She returned to her seat and waited, wishing Ion would come back. What if Ion was wrong about what the guards would do? What if they arrested the English couple and searched their bags? She had a sudden attack of conscience. She liked them. They seemed nice, harmless. A happy couple with a bright future, planning to have a baby and get married. If the guards found the drugs, Daniel and Laura's lives would be destroyed. And, she thought selfishly, the money Ion had promised would vanish before she ever got her hands on it. The border guard came back through the carriage, the ticket inspector following. Holding the door open, she could hear raised voices, Daniel protesting. What should she do? The passports and tickets were here, in Ion's bag, and she could grab them, tell Daniel and Laura that they must have dropped them on the seat. If she could reason with the guards, persuade them that she had seen the English couple with their tickets and passports when the Hungarian guards came through, that they were innocent victims of theft, that they were foolish foreigners who didn't understand that they shouldn't be in the sleeper carriage. It was her best option. She slipped through the door and went to join the party. But it hadn't gone well, had it? That was the fucking understatement of the century. Treading her way into the forest, twigs cracking beneath her feet, her eye on a spot a few feet ahead where she could piss, she almost laughed. The guards had been hostile, called her a punk bitch, and she had got angry, lost her cool, called them fascist lapdogs. That had been it. The next thing she knew they were being marched back to the carriage, Ion still AWOL, and the train was slowing to a halt and then they were thrown off. Her phone was left behind and she had no cash. She couldn't wait to get to a pay phone, to call Ion, to tell him what a fucking idiot he was and how this was all his fault. She unbuttoned her jeans and pushed them down. The jeans were so tight it was impossible to squat without toppling backwards or getting urine on her clothes. This was ridiculous. She unlaced one boot and pulled it off before pulling one leg out of her jeans. Okay, this would work. She was even more happy that no one was watching her. As she crouched, she thought about how, despite this hiccup, the situation could still be redeemed. The plan could still work. The cocaine was still in the backpacks, undiscovered. Daniel and Laura had no passports or access to money. They would have to go home. When they reached town they would be able to hitchhike, or sell that fancy camera to get some cash for train tickets. She would escort the English couple to Bucharest, encourage them to take a plane home and let Camelia know their flight number. It would be Camela's job to intercept the couple, enlisting one of her dodgy friends, a pair of muggers with knives. Daniel and Laura wouldn't put up much resistance. Yes, it would still work. And then she would have her share of the money. No harm done apart from a truncated holiday for the English couple. She finished and stood, pulling up her knickers and slipping her leg back into her jeans. She reached out for her boot and heard a noise. Her heart paused. Was someone there? She peered into the darkness, and heard more noises, a crunch, a rustle, something snapping, but before she could cry out there was a hand over her mouth and another on her throat, breath warm in her ear and a voice whispering that if she struggled or tried to scream, she would die. Chapter 43. Where the fuck was Alina? Back home in Sibiu, Ion couldn't do anything, couldn't eat, couldn't shit. Couldn't sleep, without this question flashing in neon lights inside his head. It had been more than 2 days now since he saw her standing on the train platform, a figure that grew smaller and smaller as the train gathered pace. The two Brits stood beside her, the backpacks beside them on the ground. He focused on the bags, a knot growing in his stomach as the precious drugs, all that money in powdered form, vanished into the distance. But, he had thought, sitting down before he attracted the attention of the guards, it would be fine. Alina was there. She would ensure the plan went ahead, that Daniel and Laura got on a plane home. Maybe it would take a while for them to get to Bucharest and onto a plane, if none of them had any money. But Alina was smart. Ion knew, despite his constant references to his own genius, that she was cleverer than him. He wished he'd been chucked off the train too, or had seen what was going on in time to jump off after them, but he'd been too busy chatting with a pretty girl in the buffet car. Still, at least the Brits hadn't been thrown off on their own. Left to their own devices they'd probably wander into the forest and be eaten by bears. So Ion waited. He was tired out by all the excitement and slept a lot, like his pet cat. He made sure his phone was charged and beside him at all times. Needing to score some weed, he sold the British girl's Samsung and spent a happy few hours indulging his herbal side. He watched a lot of porn on his old computer. And he waited for Alina to call or knock on the door. But she didn't do either. So where the fuck was she? Chapter 44. Alina woke up and instinctively tried to roll over, but her legs wouldn't move. Every morning started the same way, she would try again to move her legs and then jerk awake, remembering that her ankles were chained to the bed. And then, with daylight creeping through the narrow gaps between the wooden boards that covered the windows, all the other memories, the horror of her situation, would come rushing back. When she got over the daily shock she always sat up, she was able to do that, and peer towards the cot, checking that little Luca was okay, waiting for the monster to come and take him from his crib and hand the baby to her. And she would cuddle him and kiss his head, that soft, fragile patch beneath his downy hair, and even when he cried she didn't mind. Despite everything, all the things the monster did to her, the terrible fear that her fate would be the same as Luca's mother's, while she had the baby to look after, she could endure. She heard movement on the stairs and braced herself. Sometimes he would bring her breakfast, bread rolls, water, meat. Animals he'd trapped in the forest, she assumed. He would inspect the room, wandering about while she ate, browsing the display of Polaroid pictures on the wall like a visitor to a ghastly exhibition. That first night, there had been a little coffin over there, but that was long gone. The monster was shorter than her, like Ion, with a beak-like nose and stringy hair the color of a sewer rat. The top of his head was bald and pocked with scars. He had the pallor of a man who never sees sunlight and his skin was always coated with grime. His teeth were yellow and gappy and his tongue was covered with a white layer. Other times he would come in, ignore her and hand her Luca along with a bottle of milk before leaving the room. He would unchain her and lock the door, leave her to roam the room, to play with Luca. She tried not to look at the Polaroids, the babies and the women who had died here. She knew that Luca's photo was there. But hers hadn't been added yet, even though the monster had flashed the camera in her face one morning. Perhaps he wouldn't add her to the wall until she was dead. Maybe that was how it worked. The monster always left food for Luca, baby food in jars, along with shampoo and creams and nappies. He instructed her to ensure the baby was fed, clean, in good health. She realized very quickly that this was her role, an enslaved nanny. And this wouldn't have been so bad, terrible, but not the worst fate in the world, if it wasn't for the other role she had to play. Because on the worst mornings, once or twice a week, he would pull the covers off her, tie her wrists to the rusting bed posts and, after squirting some kind of lube onto himself, he would climb on top and push himself into her. She would close her eyes and tried not to inhale his stinking breath, the stench of body odor that came off him. After he came and hoisted himself off her, she would be desperate to wash in the basin in the corner of the room, to use a little of the baby soap on herself. But he wouldn't let her. Instead, every time, he lifted her bottom and pushed a cushion beneath her, elevating her so his semen remained inside her. He always left her like that for an hour, naked and exposed, hands and feet chained to the bed, before returning and untying her. Sometimes, flies would land on her body, crawling about on her skin, and she would buck and thrash, unable to shift them as they sipped at her flesh. Every time, she would lie and sob for hours, clutching little Luca to her, praying to God that the monster's seed would not find fertile ground. That her body would reject it. Chapter 45. Ion stepped off the bus, wrapping his coat around him, and looked up. And down the street at the prefabricated buildings, the grim-faced women pushing prams, the cars with ancient license plates. He'd looked it up online. Briva used to be a prosperous gold mining town, and there was even a museum of gold here. He laughed humorlessly at the thought of tourists visiting this place. Ha! He bet Daniel and Laura didn't have this ghost town on their fancy itinerary. After a few days had passed and Alina still hadn't called, Ion began to get really worried. He called Camelia in London and asked her to check if Daniel and Laura were home. Rather bad-temperedly, she had agreed and called back to report that there were lights on in their flat, that she had seen people moving around inside. She hung about until someone matching Daniel's description came outside to put some trash out. So they had gone home. "I'll post you the keys," Ion said to Camelia, "and you can go inside, check their backpacks. They must have found the stuff by now." He was paranoid about mentioning the drugs on the phone. "Can you check the English news? Any reports of tourists finding, stuff in their backpacks?" Camelia had laughed in a way that made his balls crawl up into his body. "Ion, I can't believe you." "What? Why? You really think your girlfriend," the word dripped with contempt, "would have followed your original plan? What would you do if you were her? You'd take the stuff and vanish. Sell it and keep all the money yourself." "I wouldn't." "Well, I would. And that's exactly what Alina would do. She'd take the money and use it to buy pens and pads so she could work on her stupid comic books. I bet you £1,000, shit, I've been living here too long, that's what she's done. She wouldn't risk the English couple taking it through customs, which, let's face it, was a ludicrous idea, probably the worst you've ever had, and that's saying something. Hey. It was genius." Camelia laughed at that for a while. He amazed himself, even when she was mocking him, he found it impossible not to picture Camilla's lovely breasts, which she'd showed him once in exchange for an eighth of weed. "Face it, Ion. The drugs. What? Who is this? The stuff is long gone. Your punk princess has taken it and you'll never see her again. And after you promised me a share of that money, I'm stuck here pole dancing for limp-dicked perverts. Thanks a lot." She hung up. The more he thought about it, the more he realized Camelia was right. Hell, Alina had probably planned to get herself, Daniel and Laura kicked off the train. Cause a big fight with the guards, make them so angry that they would feel compelled to stop and eject her and the Brits. Then she would sneak the stuff. The coke, it was safe, he reminded himself, if it was only in his head, out of their backpacks and find someone to buy it. Furious, he went into the bedroom where Alina had left some of her artwork, the comic book she'd been working on for months, and tore it into shreds. He didn't feel any better, so he punched the wall, but that hurt like hell. He yelled, making the cat shoot out of the room, and then looked around at the dump where he lived. He needed that money. He'd planned everything he was going to buy. The new TV, the gaming chair, the bearskin rug. He had been robbed. She wasn't going to get away with it. He found a small, cheap room in a Briva hotel that smelled of cabbage and cabbage-induced farts and threw his bag down on the bed. He felt like a bounty hunter, retracing Alina's steps. He had already been to the station where Alina and the Brits had been kicked off the train. It was a spooky place, not a soul in sight, unless you counted the little pack of dogs that were hanging around. One of them growled at him and he chucked a stone at it, making it yelp and run away. He spotted a map pinned up inside the abandoned waiting room and kicked in the door so he could go inside and take a proper look. Where would they have gone from here? He wandered out to look at the abandoned village, the quiet road. It was possible they'd hitched a lift, but how much traffic would there be in the middle of the night? None. Surely they would have headed towards the nearest town, Briva. He imagined them sitting here, waiting for first light, then walking into town along the road. That's what he would have done. So here he was, having trekked through the forest, lovely in the morning light. Alina had been here. He could sense it. He had a photograph of her and he took it around town, going into bars and shops, asking if anyone remembered her. No one did. They all looked at the photograph with blank eyes. The young people asked him what it was like in the big city and he told them about the great riches there, how it was a place where dreams came true. He took a local girl with haunted eyes back to his fart-stinking room and showed her his genius beneath the sheets until the guy in the next room banged on the wall. The next night there was another girl, and the night after that there were two. He had intended to stay in town for a few days, until he either found some useful information about Alina or failed. He ended up staying for over a month. Back home he was a nobody. An ant in the colony. Here though, as the exotic stranger, the man from the big city, he was a somebody, and he liked it. Maybe he could stay here forever, sleep his way through all the girls in town, although that was risky. He'd already had to hide out for a few days after the boyfriend of one of the girls he'd slept with found out about them and came looking for the out-of-towner. Despite his pumped body, Ion was a yellow-bellied chicken when it came to violence. It was one of the reasons the gangs back home wouldn't let him join. And on top of the danger from jealous boyfriends, he was running out of money, and there were no jobs here even if he wanted one. He needed the money he would get from selling the cocaine. And if Alina had already sold the coke and spent the cash, he would make do with revenge. But he had no way of finding her, no leads. Until he met the policeman.